So, without any further ado, Lance Lindblom, and feel free to add anything I missed.
Always wondered what the ado meant.
Yeah.
What I'd like to talk to you about today are foundations and social change. And maybe if we have a little time after that, talk a little bit about the context of political situation that we have today, and maybe a few words of hard-earned wisdom that have come from many scars and experience. So let's see how that operates. In dealing with social change, how many are really interested in social change here? Okay, I'm going to randomly pick somebody. You, can you tell me what social change is?
I think change in society, seeing a before and an after.
If I seized power and I became dictator, would that be social change?
I don't know.
Anybody else have any other ideas? Thank you, by the way. Thanks. Well, social change really is the redistribution of power, authority, and resources within the society. But that doesn't tell you where the social change is going. And so you have to have a goal of where you're going. So if you're changing those power, resources, and authority within the society, for what purpose are you doing it? Because you could go from a one-person dictatorship, a plutocracy, an aristocracy. All that would be social change in the United States. So I kind of think of social change as the society enabling each individual to develop to the maximum amount of their capabilities and abilities based on the material basis and resources in the society, of course, under environmental constraints and under social justice, civic justice, and economic justice. So that's my goal, but there may be other goals and other perceptions about what you want to do with social change. Now, why don't we have social change? So many people have these goals that they want to get to, and I think the primary reason is interests. There's always a reason why we can't get there. It's usually an interest. I used to talk with my staff and I used to say, 20% of the time it's a problem of knowledge and information. The other 80% of the time it's a problem of an interest in the way. That could be an oil lobby, or it could be, people who don't want their taxes raised. I mean, all kinds of interests. So in dealing with social change, what you have to do is devise strategy and tactics which are either going to co-opt those interests, go around those interests, defeat those interests, go under those interests, over those interests, but that's the game that you have to figure out in order to meet that goal. And there's a lot of tactics you can go through to do that. Now, philanthropy is one of the ways that you can go for social change. There are problems with that, which I'll talk about later. But let's take a look at what philanthropy could do. First of all, philanthropy is just basically means the love of mankind. And foundations really think of philanthropy, and they're a special subset of philanthropists. Foundations are institutions that are endowed with money, and they give it away. And there's all sorts of kinds of rules, like they have to give away at least 5% of that money that they have each year, and there are conflict of interest rules and things like that. But that's basically what a foundation is. And I worked for 4 of them, headed 3 of them, and they can have endowments from $20 million to $13 billion. And I've worked for foundations that have given, $3 million away and $550 million away a year. You can do a lot with that kind of resource. Now, all cultures really have an idea of philanthropy. And what it means in all those cultures is it means giving outside the family. So you're not helping your family, you're helping for the common good. You're using everything you can, the giving of time, money, and know-how to advance the common good. Now, how can these institutions, foundations, which I just described, really help with social change? Well, let's take a 5-minute detour through some theory, and then we'll get to, practical examples of how you can do this. It's in the nature of political, economic, and social systems that they really commonly fall short providing optimal public value. Markets fail to produce public goods, governments fail to act in the public interest, and citizens fail to cooperate in pursuit of their common interests. Such failures are predictable, and we all have theories about these. And just as importantly, it is in the nature of these failures that significant social benefit can be created through relatively small interventions. This is the role for foundations. To a much greater extent than other actors, foundations are really free agents. They're not constrained by the same political, economic, and social forces that limit governments, economic institutions such as corporations, and social organizations. Foundations have no imperative to turn a profit with their grants, no concern about winning elections or currying favor, and no need to solicit donations or to build up membership. Thus, failures of markets, governments, and society to look at, create a real opportunity for these free agents and resources to be used. Now, let's just look at a couple of these failures from a theoretical basis and then show you how foundations can deal with them. There are a whole series of market failures which you probably all have dealt with if you've ever taken an Economic 101 class and remember it. There's the public goods, which is if one person consumes it, all people have to consume it, like national defense. Markets can't do that. You need governments to do that. There's the issue of externalities, which is the prime example of that are polluters, where you put the risks and costs on somebody else for your own profit. The markets don't have any way to deal with that. The markets are rarely perfectly competitive. They have barriers to entry, economies of scale, first mover advantages, a whole series of other problems. But most importantly, market efficiency doesn't mean social equity. You can have a situation where you have tremendous inequality in wealth and income, and the market doesn't care. And as a result, the market can't solve those kind of inequity issues and inequality issues. Now, the problem with government is it's not always an effective public agent. I need to tell you that now, right? There's a lack of analytic capacity sometimes, bureaucratic inertia, risk aversion, short-time horizons of political figures because of elections, so they can't take a long-term point of view. There are also issues of special interests. Special interests who are very strong and have resources, they almost always trump a more important common interest or general interest because that general interest is diffuse in its opposition. And they're concentrated in their advocacy for their position. And that's a real problem. There's also a problem of information, which there's a need to be informed in a democracy, but there's little incentive for an individual to spend a lot of money to inform themselves. So that's a whole nother problem that government has to face. And then there's the failures of collective institutions. And there's really two main. One is the common action problem. And that is when you're trying to get everybody together, it costs something. There are transaction costs. And it's difficult, and it's hard to overcome those barriers to get everybody together, even though it would be better that everybody is together to go for a common interest. So that's called the common action problem. And also, in most cases, when you're dealing with social organizations and a lack of resources, the people who are marginalized or the least powerful in the society are the people who have the most difficulty in paying those costs of getting together. Now, foundations can be unique institutions in which to address all these problems. As repositories of a great amount of money and capital that they've gained for other purposes at other times, foundations are more or less free to deploy their significant resources for risky or unpopular strategies for whatever public purpose they like. Unlike businesses whose behavior is disciplined by markets by which they operate, foundations have no need to consider whether their foundations will pay off in monetary terms. Unlike government, who must concern themselves with winning elections or maintaining support of politicians who do, foundations should be relatively more insulated from direct political pressure. And unlike voluntary organizations in society, which face a collective action problem, informing, recruiting members, soliciting contributions, foundations have no need really to recruit anybody, nor do they have a need to solicit resources. Philanthropic institutions are substantially free agents. They are, or at least can be, more nimble, more open to risk-taking, more innovative, more potentially enabled to take a long-term view. They can be idiosyncratic. They can think out of the box more than firms, politicians, and even nonprofit organizations could afford to be. The most important thing is they can afford to fail and be controversial, to venture, test, and explore without knowing specific outcomes. Foundation resources include more than the money that they disperse. Technical expertise, the ability to convene, access to the press, public credibility are more important even than their financial resources. They can also use the power of their endowments, that pile of money that they have, through stockholder actions and strategic investments. So there's a lot of influence they can have. This theory of foundation impact begins with social failure by markets, governments, and societal institutions. When other institutions fail, there are opportunities for foundations to intervene in ways that could plausibly cause great public benefit. Such strategic intervention depends not only on diagnosis of the failure, but also judgment about the relative effectiveness of altering market incentives, changing public policy, or catalyzing social action. This really is the art of philanthropy, to do that. Foundations are likely to have the greatest impact when they can address the failures of other institutions, and in doing so, catalyze market, political, or societal forces. They're likely to have a much more limited impact by engaging in purely charitable activities, such as giving away food or clothing, etc. Not that that's bad, but they have less impact. Their impact is localized. Now that we've gotten through the theory, which can be pretty dry, let's look at some of the examples of which I was fortunate enough to participate in various foundation places. Remember I said they could do really controversial things, and they could do things that governments can't do? Well, one example of that is when there were a number of dictatorships in the 80s and 90s in which we were trying to figure out a way of how we can help democratize those societies and introduce human rights. One of those dictatorships was the Philippines. It was under Ferdinand Marcos. And so we designed a way to bring an important exile leader who was in the United States back to the Philippines. The whole idea is, after studying the context of the politics of the Philippines, is we figured that this man, his name was Aquino, could catalyze all the forces of pro-democracy and freedom of expression and human rights. And so there's a great deal of planning, and the foundation financed his return to the Philippines. And we worked in the Philippines to protect him when he came and lived there. Unfortunately, when he went to the Philippines and he landed in Manila, he was immediately taken off the plane and shot and killed on the tarmac. So the issue then came up. First of all, it raised an ethical issue. How can we do these kinds of things if we're risking other people's lives? And secondly, what should we do if we try this strategy again? Well, the next time it came up was with a man named Kim Dae-jung, who was a Korean exile and was in the United States for health reasons. He had been tortured in South Korea. This is the days when General Chun was the dictator of South Korea. And there was a really human rights problem in South Korea. There was massacres in Gwangju and other places. So we're trying to figure, well, is this a strategy that could be used in Korea? So this time we got smarter, and we had Kim Dae-jung visit all these editorial staffs around the country on newspapers and everything, telling him why he was going back, etc. And then we decided to put a whole group of people around him. So we put an Assistant Secretary of State for human rights that had been under Carter, an admiral, a general, a couple of American congressmen, and some foundation people. And I went because we had decided that we would never support anything unless we ourselves were willing to do it. So, and we also tried to get in the cultural scene in those days. It was Peter, Paul, and Mary, so we had Mary from Peter, Paul, and Mary come. So we're trying to cover all the bases. And then we financed the trip back. Well, to make a long story short, after a short stop in Japan, when we landed in South Korea, the airport was surrounded by a parachute regiment. When we were going off the plane, we were beaten, and Kim Dae-jung was kidnapped and taken away, in which we call us then a big stink. And the result is it became a huge international incident, put a lot of pressure on. People, when we were there, would come up to us and saying, "Is he back? Is he back?" I mean, it was a really moving experience. And the result of all the international pressure is that it kept Kim Dae-jung alive. He was put under house arrest, and a few years later, he became president of South Korea, and after that, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, that was a pretty good grant, I think, to do that. It changed the government, but it was using it as a catalytic effect of trying to decide how you could influence what that situation is, and foundations could do this. Now, there's a whole series of strategies that you can use and that we did use. There are things called second track strategies. Again, things that the government can't do because they're too sensitive. For example, when there were insurgencies going on in Central America in the 1980s, one of them was in El Salvador, which we were doing a lot of human rights work. There was a lot of murders and death squad activities, et cetera. And the United States, that was under Reagan, was supporting a number of the right-wing groups in order to defeat the insurgents. So what we did is, after going down to El Salvador and spending time with people, is we brought back the political leader of the insurgency. And we got him a visa to come to the United States and to talk to people so they could see what the other side of this conflict was. And that, this is before your time, but it created a whole movement of people dealing with Central America and our interventions in Central America. Also, we dealt with situations, for example, in Cuba, where we could go in human rights issues. Again, second track, because nobody wanted to deal with Castro. We could go back and negotiated with Castro. And when I negotiated with him, we were trying to find, we had a list of 2,000 people. And we wanted to find out if they were jailed, what their charges were, where they were, how well they were. And we just didn't, Castro was saying, well, I'll give you a few prisoners to take back. But we didn't want to be in a flesh trade. So what we did is we really took we tried to get this list and the people accounted for and to set up a system. And while we were discussing it, we finally negotiated reciprocal prison visits, which would have been great because we could have gotten into Cuban prisons, we could have seen these political prisoners, et cetera. But they wanted to visit the Atlantic Penitentiary because there were the Marielitos, which were a group of Cubans who had emigrated to the United States in 1980, and to visit them. A lot of them were criminals. Castro essentially emptied his jails out. And we brought that proposal back to the Reagan administration, and they said no. But the fact is that we got names and we got the status of people, and we could inform families and everything and set up contacts so we could deal with some of these issues. We've dealt with that in, for example, in South Africa, before Mandela was released. We put the Broederbond, which was the right-wing group for apartheid. It was sort of the secret society that was in there, and very powerfully politically, and put them together with the ANC in a third African country so they could begin to talk to each other and lay the groundwork for what eventually happened when Mandela was released, etc. Remember when I was telling you that it was hard to get common people to deal with getting people together because of transaction costs, and maybe they were a majority, but it cost too much to get people together. Well, one of the first things that ever happened on political organizing on the internet actually happened in the 1990s. And what happened in those days is that there was a treaty that was being negotiated, all in secret, that was the treaty against the investment. It was for investment. It was called the Multilateral Treaty on Investment. The trouble with this treaty is it gave a tremendous power to capital and financial institutions that would undermine regulations, environmental safety regulations, and things like that, because they could threaten to sue if those regulations stopped them from doing business, even though the regulations could be, worth it. So this was being done in secret, and we were trying to figure out, well, how can we address this issue? Because there was these people dispersed all over the world who had no, idea that this was going on. And in those days, the OECD, which was a European organization with the US, this was essentially, we were being told it was a done deal. So what we decided to do is make a grant to a group that used this, in those days, new thing called the internet. So we put this issue up on the internet and sent it to a few groups saying, what do you think of this? We called it just to have a democratic discussion about the impact of this. Well, to our utter amazement, it went viral. And all these people started talking about it, were absolutely appalled. You would get like the French who decided that it was, that all their cultural institutions were going to be bought out and they were going to turn into Disneyland. I mean, it was just, there were demonstrations around the world about it. I think some diplomat from Canada actually leaked the treaty so then people could criticize its terms. As a result, it was defeated politically. And that was just by getting people together by this new technology that we had no idea what its power was at the time, by using the internet. We also can do that by putting groups together. The World Trade Organization was an organization in those days that had a lot of issues about worker regulations on safety and environmental regulations and human rights views, which they were ignoring. And so there was a lot of protests against the World Trade Organization. But all these groups were diverse. So what we did was fund meetings of just convening them so they could talk with each other, not saying what the result would be. So people who never talked with each other before, like labor unions, environmentalists, trade activists, social activists, all got together. And the result of that was, and this is probably before your time too, Seattle in 1999, which was a huge demonstration, and it stopped the WTO from continuing on their track. And it was really the beginning of a criticism of the WTO, which has really come into effect today. So those are all things that foundations could do. Another thing, when you're talking about being controversial and doing things government can't do or corporations can't do, in human rights you could do that a lot. For example, we had a situation where there was assassination in the United States in the 70s of the Chilean ambassador to the US by the Chilean government under Pinochet when Pinochet took over. His name was Letelier. And when he was killed by a bomb in Washington, D.C., it also killed an American citizen who worked for him, Toby Moffett. We tried to find out who did this. And there was a guy who was a head of the secret police in Chile named Contreras. And we figured somehow we've got to hold him accountable. Contreras was also running an operation in South America in those days of right-wing governments getting together and killing leftists in other countries, called Operation Condor. So when Pinochet stepped down, which was a whole nother story of how that happened, Contreras was still free, and the statute of limitations for his crimes was running out. So what did we do as a foundation? A bunch of us got together. We funded American judges of the highest status that we could get to go down there and put pressure on the government to arrest him. And he was arrested the last day of the statute of limitations. and was confined to his house until he died. But he was a terrible character. He was being held accountable. But you can use things like that, like litigation. The same thing is that years ago, we were trying to establish rights. So there was a case called Filartiga, which was about, Filartiga was a doctor who was in Paraguay, who was mainly religious, and he worked in poor communities giving aid to those poor communities in medical care. The government wasn't happy about that. It was under Stroessner in those days, who was a dictator. Well, to give a message, because they didn't want to kill the doctor, they killed his son and dropped him on his doorstep. So the question was there any way we could establish a precedent in which we could hold the people who killed him accountable? Well, it turns out that we could find out who the person was who did it within the Paraguayan government. And it also turned out, and this is how these things happen, that this guy was off in the United States, and he sent a postcard back. And the postcard was to go to his house, which happened to be down the street from Filartiga. Well, the postcard was delivered to Filartiga. So we knew then he was in the jurisdiction, or people knew he was in the jurisdiction, and they sued him. And what you can get as a foundation, because people would tell you you really can't do this, we took an old jurisdictional statute that nobody had ever used. Nobody kind of knew what it was. All they knew, it was passed in 1790. And it said that if you had in personam jurisdiction, meaning if you had the person and they violated an international law, you could charge them in a court. I think it was about pirates, to grab pirates. So this was used, and it was found that torture was an international crime and that he was guilty. And then we went in to do a judgment on him, a monetary judgment, and he flew the jurisdiction and hid. But it was trying to hold him accountable. But by establishing that precedent, then later we had somebody in Guatemala, again in the 80s, there was tremendous civil wars going on in Central America in the 1980s. And there was a number of people under a guy named Rios Montt. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, because he's been in the paper lately, because he's 80-something, and he was being charged with crimes against humanity. He had a tendency to go into Indian villages and just wipe them out. He killed thousands of people. And when I knew him, he was a colonel and a real piece of work. But anyway, he, in Guatemala, there was another military man who wanted to be president, who was also had been involved in a lot of war crimes. His name was Gramajo. Because he was tainted because of these crimes, and my alma mater did this, and I don't know why, the Kennedy School at Harvard brought him into their mid-career program. And he did it, and Gramajo was going to run for president of Guatemala. This terrible guy was going to run for president of Guatemala. And he was sort of going to the Kennedy School to get cleansed, you know. So he was at the Kennedy School, and we're thinking, what can we do? Well, we remember Filartiga. We have this thing, and he had been involved in the torture and killing. So and the Kennedy School wouldn't do anything. So when he went up to get his degree at the Kennedy School, we served him with a subpoena. And it got into the New York Times, and it was in front page news, and he flew the jurisdiction because he didn't want to face the court, and essentially disappeared and didn't become the president of Guatemala. Again, these are things that if you were thinking, you know, that you could do. I could go through a whole set of examples of things like this, supporting technology, lawsuits, holding government accountable. But in human rights in those days, there were laws that said that you couldn't trade with human rights violators, etc. So nobody would do this in the government, but we would set out and document how they violated human rights laws and then bring that to the attention of the Congress. And as a result, trade would be cut off, or there would be penalties. They wouldn't get military aid or development aid. So there were ways that you could, again, leverage with very small amounts of money and activity. Groups could have a really big impact. Now, I could go through a lot of examples on this, but a lot of you are interested in technology. And one of the things that foundations can do is they can take things that are developed in one field and nobody's thinking about it and put them in another field and really help. Again, in the human rights area, we were working with the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but in Argentina, it was a group of mothers who had lost their children who had been disappeared and killed. Most of them had been either shot or dumped out of helicopters over the South Atlantic Ocean. We're talking thousands. And these mothers, very brave, got together and they wanted accountability for, in Argentina for the loss of their kids. So they would demonstrate every particular day of every week, and sometimes they'd be arrested or whatever, but they never gave up. Well, one of the things that turned out that a lot of these young people who had been picked up and killed by the government had young babies. Some of the women who had been tortured actually had babies in prison, and then they'd kill the mother. And these babies were adopted by the people who tortured them and by the military. So we're thinking, how can we deal with this? Well, there were some people in California who were working on this new stuff with DNA, and we said, well, we'll give you money if you could try to use this new approach to finding out what kids belong to these now grandparents. And lo and behold, they were like thrilled to do it, and that led to development of DNA tests to find out grandparents. And I was just in Argentina last year, and they had found, I don't know, the 100th child who was now 40 years old who had been adopted. I mean, all of this through the DNA test. And those were foundation grants that really set that up. Another thing, I've been talking a lot about human rights, but in Argentina during the junta, which was the military was ruling Argentina, when they did all this killing, they also had mass graves. And these mass graves were being discovered. And people wanted to try the junta, but they needed to develop evidence. Well, there weren't a lot of forensic pathologists in Argentina. So the question was, and we sent one person down there, a very famous person called Clyde Snow, and he had this brilliant idea. His idea was, well, there aren't forensic pathologists, but we can get archaeologists and train them to disinter these graves. And that's what they did. They developed the evidence, and they put a bunch of the junta people in jail. So, you know, these are, again, things, if you take the heat, that you can do. You know, there are a lot of things running underground newspapers in Poland for freedom of expression purposes. We developed a way there's an organization now called the National Security Archives that declassifies documents that are secret and has a big library, and we helped form that. But you know how that started? Again, Foundation went in and said, two people came to me. One was a New York Times reporter. Another was had written several books and was involved in dealing with issues in Central America. And these two guys knew each other, and they happened to be drinking beers one day when they realized that they had all these documents. One had them stored in his attic, the other in his garage. And they realized they had the same documents and that they were censored differently. So you give a grant to compare the documents. And the result is you had a clearer document, and that started this whole process, which resulted in a huge institution, the National Security Archive. So those are all, you know, things, again, that foundations can do. But they also can deal with big issues. And sometimes you have to do it by trying to outthink, you know, the interests that you're trying to deal with. One thing is, we all know there's tremendous inequality in the United States, and it's increased tremendously in my lifetime. I mean, until the mid-70s, from after World War II to the mid-70s, things were actually getting more and more equal. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but there was more equality in the sense, I'm not racial equality or gender equality, but I'm talking about economic equality. And then it started near the last years of Carter into Reagan to start to be more unequal. So we're thinking one of the issues that we really wanted to deal with was inequality. Well, how can you deal with inequality? Well, we're sitting there thinking, we're sitting in those days in Nathan Cummings Foundation on $500 to $600 million. We own a lot of stock. It turns out that you can vote your stock in a stockholders meeting. Well, one of the things we found out was that CEOs had unbelievable salaries that had increased exponentially over the past 10 years. You know, if you looked in 1992, 1994, there was a study done by Lucian Bebchuk of Harvard Law School that said that the top 5 people in S&P 500 corporations their salaries and benefits accounted for 4.2% of the profits. That's a huge amount of money. But it turns out in the 2002, 2003, that same group accounted for 10.4% of the profits. It's unbelievable, the inequality. So we're thinking, how can we deal with this? And then we found out those people, that group of people, they were the people that if you looked at the top 1/10 of 1%, where most of the inequality really goes, the top 1% has 40 to 50% of the wealth, but that 1/10 has a lot of that. And if you look at that 1/10, a lot of those people are these guys, okay? And they determine the culture. They're the people who give the most political contributions. They extraordinarily account for a large percentage of the political contributions that go on. And the rest of the people that are in that 1/10 of 1% are people who usually work for them. Lawyers, real estate agents, and people like that. And only, I think, about a quarter of those people in the 1/10% are people who inherit it. So most of the people, a lot of the corporations were institutions that redistributed money up. So what we do, we got a whole bunch of people who had endowments, like New York Pension Fund, the pension funds in California, CalPERS and CalSTRS, a number of foundations, a number of other pension funds, and we started bringing stockholder actions as stockholders saying, we're paying these guys too much. And they actually, in the financial reform, passed a law that said that you had to have a stockholder vote to approve the CEO compensation. And I don't know, a few years ago, this was a huge issue, and that's what raised that issue, in attacking those CEO salaries. And that's a big part of the inequality in this country. The trouble is it has those political and economic implications. Well, anyway, I could go on and on about how the foundations can change a whole attitude towards a particular subject. I'll give you one more. In environmental law, we sat down about 10 years ago and tried to figure out, environmental movement was going nowhere. There was a lot of talk and everything, but there wasn't a lot of change that had happened since it had originally started in the 1970s, 1980s. Very little progress had been made after that, after those laws had been passed. So we're thinking, maybe we have to take a look at this. So we got 2 younger guys and we said, look, take a fresh look at this, and gave them money, and they did. And what they found was that if you go up to a person and say, the world is going to end unless you change your ways, that people just shut off. They just go to the beach, if the world's going to end, hell, So that was not the tactic to take. But if you remember, most environmentalists went up, and that's how they do it. The world's going to end, what's the matter with you, So we're trying to say, well, is there another approach? And these young guys came up with an approach, was green jobs. So it was trying to get rid of that thing where there was not a division between the environment and economic growth or jobs. And it was actually quite good. And they titled their paper to get attention, "The Death of Environmentalism." Huge explosion. Environmentalists went nuts, you know, huge discussion and everything. But the important thing is a new approach was being discussed, and it resulted in Obama coming up with the Green Jobs Program. And if you look at the situation today, you find out there are a lot more people working in solar energy than there are mining coal. So, you know, you can change an attitude that way, but it has costs, and it causes a lot of problems. In people saying, "What do you mean the death of environmentalism?" It wasn't the death. It wasn't changing, dealing with climate change and everything. It was trying to change the approach, and to take a look at how best we could address these issues. So those are just some examples, and in the questions I can give you lots more. You know, it's a big mistake to have me start talking about this stuff because I'll go through war stories and things like that. So, but the problem is that the situation is changing. In the days that I was able to do this kind of work with 4 foundations, they were kind of eccentric, and they were risk-taking, and they were not afraid of controversy. Today, people are much more afraid of controversy. First of all, there's a problem with foundations in that there's a conflict between parochial interests, that's how the money was earned, with the idea of giving it away for the common good. One represents kind of non-reciprocal, non-self-interested organic relationships versus market calculus that is reciprocal and self-interested. So what do we have today in these foundations? Foundations are ruled by boards. Look at who is on those boards. They're corporate people. You know, there are a few non-government NGO types, but there are NGOs that in many cases are dependent upon the corporate people or dependent upon the foundations. I don't know if you were looking at the New York Times, but a perfect example of this was the New America Foundation, who had a guy named Barry Lynn who was writing about monopolies. He was an analyst and director of a program about open markets. And he was a guy who was very, very critical of Google and his viewing of monopoly power that Google has. Well, Google was one of the main funders of the New America Foundation, which was a nonprofit. And Barry Lynn, who was the guy who was fired because he was ticking off Google. Now, they'll deny it and say that's not true. There was another reason. He wasn't collegial. He wasn't collegial, meaning he wasn't not attacking Google. But, you know, there are those issues that happen all the time under the table. And so you have those issues. That free agent and lack of accountability is also a problem. So, and when you have very rich people looking at certain issues, it's just that the perspective can be skewed. So if you have an issue of, say, education, and you want to have people better educated, I can show you study after study, show you examples of like Finland or some, and say the major issue there is there has to be more equality within the schools. There has to be more economic equality. And that schools do better when there is more economic equality. But if you're going and you're looking at it from another perspective, we got to hold teachers accountable. We got to test them. Got to make sure they're performing, you know, and we'll base salaries on that, you know, without an idea of how you measure performance or whatever. Or if you're dealing with employment, it may be that the issue is, I can remember periods when we had virtually full employment, 2 or 3% unemployment, which is frictional unemployment. Why? Because there was a tremendous amount of building going on. There was government investment in infrastructure and things like that. And there was no issues with job training or anything. People trained people because they needed them. And wages went up. But what do we have now? This is a situation where we have unemployment. What do? We're going to train you. It's your issue. We train you. And what we do is, when we take that individualistic approach sometimes, is we just change who's in the queue, where they are in the queue. We're not really dealing with the whole problem. So anyway, those are things that foundations can do, and those are some of the problems that they face, is that they often become transmission belts for a plutocracy. And it's that same plutocracy that does the political contributions, that influences the political process. It's the same group that helps determine the culture, etc. So those are the things that you have to watch out for when you're dealing with the foundations. And unfortunately, it's becoming more and more that way, because there's a kind of emphasis on the development of the individual and your own self-realization, rather than the common good or what you can do for others. It sounds fruity and banal, but that is a real problem. And I have been in meetings where people are trying to start family foundations, and consultants will go in and they'll say, "What's your passion? What do you want to do? And I'll help you do it." Well, they're just selling their services. Because the question is what needs to be done? Not what's my passion. It's nice if I like it, but I mean, if my passion is something ridiculous and often to the side that doesn't make an impact, what difference does it make? Well, anyway, that's the issue with the foundations. Do we have a couple more minutes? Because I want to go through kind of political context. If people aren't bored. Okay. I'd like to suggest a book. It's called The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics, by a guy named David Goodhart. It's about taking a new look and across, how we talk about classes and races and gender and everything in our politics. He divides it in a completely different way that's very interesting. There are two groups of people. Of course, they overlap and everything. Those two groups of people are anywheres and somewheres. Anywheres and somewheres. Now, anywheres are progressive individualism. They have a worldview for more or less successful individuals who care about society. They place a high value on autonomy, mobility, and novelty, and a much lower value on group identity, tradition, and national social contacts in contracts like faith, family, flag. Most are comfortable with immigration, regional and international integration, the spread of human rights, all of which tend to dilute the claims of national citizenship. They are not anti-national, but they can be quite patriotic, but see themselves as citizens of the world. Work, and in fact, life itself is about individual self-realization. Anywheres are comfortable with the achievement society, meritocracy, and most forms of equality, except maybe economic equality. Does that describe anybody in this room? Citizens of the world, meritocracy. But then there are somewheres. And the somewheres are rooted in a place. Let's call them decent populists. They're more socially conservative and communitarian by instinct. They may be religious, and only a small number are hard authoritarians or consistent xenophobes. They are nationalistic and feel uncomfortable about many aspects of cultural and economic change, such as mass immigration, an achievement society in which they struggle to achieve the reduced status and opportunities of non-graduate employment and more fluid gender roles. They do not choose between open and closed society, but want an openness that does not disadvantage them. In the main, they are modern, and accept at least some of the concepts of women's equality and minority rights, distrust power, and they love free expression, consumerism, and individual choice. They want many of the same things as anywheres, but they want them more slowly and in more moderation. A large number of somewheres feel that they have been left behind. And the reason is, 40 years ago, the somewheres were the vast majority of people. And now It's the interests of the anywheres, that when they're at stake, they virtually won every battle, and they set the political agenda. And what we see now is a huge rebellion of the somewheres against the anywheres. And that's the issue that we face. That's what's behind Brexit. That's what's behind the American politics. It's those people who have been rooted and feel like they've been left behind. And it crosses economic boundaries and classes and genders and things like that. But that I think that Goodhart was very insightful in putting that out. Well, the question is, what do you do about it? And another book, which I'll recommend, which will make you angry, but it's important to read. It's called The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics by Mark Lilla. And he talks about the politics of identity is nothing new, of course. It's, the right has been using it. We've had nativist movements in the United States. The white Protestant group identity that feels so threatened in a lot of cases today, whether for good reason or not. The principle of identity, unfortunately, when you use it, doesn't really challenge inequality or social justice at all. And identity politics on the left was at first about large classes of people, African Americans, women's gender equality, seeking to redress major historical wrongs by mobilizing and then working through our political institutions to secure their rights. But according to Lilla, and I'd have to say to a certain extent in my own experience, by the 1980s it had given way to a pseudo-politics of self-regard and increasing narrow and exclusionary self-definition. The main result has been to turn young people back onto themselves rather than turning them outward towards the wider world. It has left them unprepared to think about common good and what must be done to practically secure it, especially the hard and unglamorous task of persuading people very different from themselves and who believe very differently from themselves. To join that task has to be a common effort. Every advance of liberal identity conscious has masked a retreat of liberal political consciousness, without which a vision of America's future can't be imagined. So essentially, it's an issue of turning into oneself rather than outward looking and bridging those gaps that are within the society and addressing the issues and concerns of other people. In all of this, and as a conclusion, there's an iron law of democracy. That's anything achieved through movement politics can be undone by institutional politics. And part of that problem is, if I go to Cheryl, and Cheryl's in power, and I don't like what she's doing, I go, Cheryl, I don't like what you're doing. I'm going to make it miserable for you. I'm going to really protest you to the ground. Let's talk. Now, what have I done? First of all, I recognize Cheryl's power. Okay? I've accepted her agenda and her framework, and I've also already said I'm willing to compromise. Okay? I've completely disemboweled my power by doing that. Now, what should have been done? You have to get a hold of the institutions to change them. What I should have done is, Cheryl, I don't like what you're doing. Get the hell out of the way. I'm taking over. That's the approach. It's taking over those institutions. It's getting away from the politics of just protest. Protest has a place, but just protest, and actually using power. Power is how you get things done. Authority is how you get things done. It should be accountable power and accountable authority, but that's how you get things done. And in a lot of ways, people don't want to take the responsibilities of power because it's imperfect. The results are imperfect, but it's very important to do that. So the last things are, at least according to Mark Lilla, and this is all from Mark Lilla, the priorities are that there should be institutional over movement politics. The second thing is democratic persuasion over aimless self-expression and, self-righteousness. And the third thing is to emphasize citizenship over group or personal identity in order to cross those bridges. So those are the approaches and some ideas to put together to deal with some of the politics and the context that we're in. The last, if we come up during the question period, if we have time, I left the laws of Levy last time. that are, I had a sociology professor many years ago when I was at graduate school at Princeton, and when I used to talk about Karl Marx and Veblen and Keynes and all that, he used to sit me down and say, "You need to open up a Carvel ice cream stand." And I thought he was crazy, but I was up here in this theoretical world, and not like where people were, and that's what he was trying to tell me. Well, he had 9 laws, now 10 laws. There were actually, I gave you 11 laws the last time I was here, but I'm not sure about the 11th law. But the 10 laws of Levy, which are the laws of disillusionment of the true liberal. And if we have time, I'd just like to read these.
And if you're willing, I think we should take some questions.
Sure. So should I wait on this, do you think? No. Okay. Here are the 10 laws.
You're in power.
I protest. No. The first law is large numbers of things are determined and therefore not subject to change. The second law is anticipated events never live up to expectations. The third law, which was the hardest for me, was that segment of the community which one has the greatest sympathy as a liberal inevitably turns out to be one of the most narrow-minded and bigoted segments of the community. And there's a reformulation of that law simply saying, last guys don't finish nice. Now, the fourth law is something that I found the most useful. Always pray that your opposition is wicked. In wickedness, there is a strong strain towards rationality. Therefore, there is always the possibility, in theory, of handling the wicked by outthinking them. Corollary 1, good intentions randomize behavior. Subcorollary 1, good intentions are far more difficult to cope with than malicious behavior. Corollary 2, if good intentions are combined with stupidity, it's impossible to outthink them. Number 5, in an enemy, there is cowardice and uncritical thinking. 6, to have a sense of humor is to be a tragic figure. 7, to know thyself, its ultimate form of aggression. 8, no amount of genius can overcome a preoccupation with detail. 9, only God can make a random selection. And 10, eternal boredom is the price of constant vigilance. Now, when I first got those, I thought, thanks, I'm graduating and out. But like years later, all these things started to seep in and make sense. And especially the fourth one about praying your enemy was evil, therefore they're rational, turned out to be the truest insight of all. And it was the most difficult when you were dealing with people who were supposedly good intentioned, because it just like totally randomized your behavior, and it was impossible to organize or do anything. So with that, any questions you have, I'd be happy to try to answer. Yeah, yes.
First of all, thanks for your talk. You mentioned accountable power, and one thing that struck me while you were talking about foundations, the work you were describing had you operating unaccountably across state lines. Like
International boundaries, yes.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I look back at it now, and I realize that some of it is hubris, and that I knew what was right. We knew what was right, and we had that streak, which is I now realize as I get older that that's very, very dangerous. And you can understand where people would be reticent to let in foundations when they're doing that kind of work. So no, you're exactly right. And now I think it's a real danger. You have huge foundations like Gates, that gives away billions of dollars. The difficulty is that small amount of money comparatively to public money wags public money. So maybe it accounts for 0.5% of public budget, but it can wag the whole public budget. And that's very dangerous because it is unaccountable. The only way to deal with that, I think, is pluralism by having foundations be much smaller, not over a certain size or whatever. But there's a lot of plutocratic aspects, as I said, about foundations. And I'm highly skeptical about them now. I mean, there's some days I think they should just be taxed and the money distributed democratically, because at least it would be, there would be democratic institutions that could distribute the money. I would be for that, except there's a plutocracy that actually controls the political people who would distribute the money. So, but you're exactly right. And I think, and as I look back at it, I think some of the stuff we really did overstep.
I'm having a bit of whiplash now after what's felt like an apology for foundations, because that also seems like a fairly cogent critique of foundations. I almost want to hear that talk now too.
Oh, well, we can do it afterwards. No, I'd have to say, and I did this while I was in president of a foundation. I was extremely critical. There was a lot of stuff that was going on. We never talk about the terrible things that some foundations have done. Okay, I'll give an example. The Carnegie Foundation. Everybody thinks they're great. They are a great foundation. They've done a lot for education and stuff like that. Do you know that the Carnegie Foundation in the 1930s did a study on white poverty in South Africa? And the people that were involved in that study and stuff, it resulted in the Nationalist Party, which instituted apartheid. Now, you can't blame it entirely on them, but I mean, they were a factor. The same thing, if you look at a lot of foundations like in the 20s and 30s, what were they involved in? They were involved in eugenics. There were progressive forces that wanted to limit immigration because it was polluting the gene pool. So there's a whole history to this. That's why I think as I get older, and of course I'm retired, there needs to be more accountability. Yes?
Yeah, that kind of speaks to a question that I had, that if you have a foundation that doesn't necessarily have somebody that's answering to, or like an organization of power, what happens when you have two foundations that maybe have competing goals who are going after the same type of thing? One's on one side and one's on the other. I mean, has that happened before? Is there any
Say like
organizational process for that?
a George Soros and a David Koch? Yeah, right, exactly.
Yes.
They fight.
It's kind of the money.
And that's part of the problem, and that's one of my criticisms. It then becomes just an inner plutocratic fight. It doesn't deal with anybody else. It's like, when elephants fight, everybody else gets squashed. And that's a real big issue. No, there's no way to sort it out. I mean, if you really want to think about it, you know how people talk about family foundation? And I've worked for 2 family foundations. Think about that. You're on the board of a family foundation if you're in the family. And you get a tax break for giving the money away. Except for Indian law, that's one of the last vestiges of a genetic pool being endowed and supported by government. And the trouble with endowing and empowering by genetics is there's always a regression towards the mean. So, that's a real issue too. And you can deal with some of those issues by having outside directors and stuff, but it's a problem, and people don't want to face that. I mean, there is a literature being developed that's highly critical of foundations. I mean, what I gave you is I was fortunate enough to do these things that I just went into foundations not as a career. I went into it like Willie Sutton. Have you ever heard of Willie Sutton? Willie Sutton was in the 1950s, even before my time. He was a famous bank robber. And when he was arrested and he was being brought to jail, a reporter asked, "Hey, Willie, why do you rob banks?" And Willie said, "Because that's where the money is." And that's partly here, when I saw early in, when I was working in government and as a lawyer and stuff, there were eccentric piles of money. And in those days, there really were eccentrics who were willing to take risks and stuff. So I didn't even view it as a career or as a calling, whatever. It was dealing with those issues. And this enabled people like me to deal with those issues and raise a family and do all that, eat, yeah.
When you're intervening in international situations, as you've discussed, did you ever have conflicts or conversations around like moral relativism and perspectives as you're putting around in other places?
Yeah, all the time, actually. And there were a lot of ethical prescriptions because people risked their lives and died. I mean, especially in the human rights issues. It's very hard, and it's harder now after having gone through a lot of this. I know when we were doing these ethical prescriptions, I think of this one woman I know in Central America who was involved in dealing against death squads. And we had this conversation one day. And I said, well, what you do is very dangerous. You know, well, the conversation actually started when we were going to dumps. Right-wing death squads would kill people and dump them in the garbage dumps. So we would go in the morning in garbage dumps to find people. And so when we were doing this, the first thing I said is, oh my God, how could this happen? I mean, this was terrible. I said, what did these people do? And this woman looked at me and said, Lance, you're such an American. They didn't do anything. They don't have to do anything for this to happen. You know, and then we got into this conversation about how dangerous this was, and this, unfortunately, this woman was later killed. And I said, but you're risking your life, you're risking your family. And she goes, the issue is, it's not whether we succeed. She says, I have the privilege of fighting. And in those days, that was a very good answer to me. But as I get older, I realized that was a very romantic answer, you know, because she died. And the question was, what was the impact? How many in this room remember or have heard about the wars that went on in Central America in the 1980s? And thousands, tens of thousands of people were killed in those wars, you know? I mean, when I look back at that stuff, there was a lot of people who sacrificed themselves, and a lot of people are walking the earth today because they did. But, you know, who remembers every one of those conflicts? I mean, the Civil War in Mozambique. I mean, how many people remember that? One of the worst civil wars I've seen. Or Yugoslavia, or any of these places. But the moral relativism, in some cases, and some of the issues that we were doing, it was very clear. It was bad guys killed innocent people. Yeah. You know, so it wasn't hard. But the difficulty was to the degree that you enable people to take risks, even if it's for doing a good thing, you know, that could result in bad things happening to them. And that was a very tough ethical issue. And the only way that we dealt with it is we wouldn't do anything that that I wouldn't do. So then I would go on all these missions just to, to see, first of all, to put the ear to the ground and to figure out what was going on, but also to know what the risks were and everything. But it's that's a tough issue. It was not so much the relativism as the ethical questions. Like, I have no problem with somebody stopping from eating another person. There are certain lines that, that I would draw, or torturing, or whatever. I mean, but there are gray areas that get very difficult. And one of the big issues that came up in the human rights movement, and especially happened in South Africa, Mandela used to talk about this a lot, and in Chile, is when the old regime was kicked out, the only way you could get it to stand down without a civil war was that if you gave them amnesty, but they had to say what their crimes were. They had to admit to their crimes. And if they didn't admit to their crimes, they could be prosecuted. That was a huge argument. It was called impunity in the human rights movement. And that dealt with moral relativism. People who said, well, yeah, that, they want democracy, it would stop a war and all the, I'm for that. And other people would say, no, these were criminals, something had to be done with them. Because they were awful people. These are people who killed thousands of people. So what do you do? My view was it was up to the people to decide. It wasn't me to decide. They had to decide that. But that's the only time I've seen real relativism and have a huge discussion and fight over it. I don't know if that...
No, that was...
Yeah.
Could you tell me about Kim Dae-jung's story? A little bit about
What about...
How could you be in the middle of the situation?
Well, he actually came to us, and he was with a group that came to us to talk. He was quite a man. He was, I would say, a rip-on Republican, a moderate Republican type, Catholic, very principled, though I hear his sons got in trouble with corruption, which is too bad. But the story of Kim Dae-jung is one of those amazing stories of a person who was in the opposition in South Korea, went to Japan because he had been released by the authorities. And while in Japan, and I'm not making this up, he was kidnapped by the Yakuza, put on a boat, brought into the Sea of Japan. Chains and weights were put on him. He was going to be dumped over the side of the boat when planes buzzed the boat. And I think they were American planes, but Americans won't admit that they did it. They buzzed it, and so they didn't dump him overboard. And they brought him back to South Korea. And he came to the United States that when Reagan came in, Reagan said that he would visit with Chun, that Chun could come and visit Reagan as his first person. And if part of the deal was that if that happened, he had to release Kim Dae-jung to the United States for health reasons. So that's how it happened. And then when we went back, and had all this kidnapping and stuff, later I've got a bunch of things. He did calligraphy for me and stuff on the plane before we got off, because we didn't know what was going to happen. But he was an amazingly brave man, amazingly brave. I don't know if that.
I knew kind of his stories. I personally know his secretary.
Yeah.
Cummings, and he talked about his situation at that moment. And then I was shocked because you're talking about the Kim Dae-jung, because it's like a long story,
Well, I mean, there's so many stories with that, and maybe we can talk later. But I was in the room when he was with Kim Young-sam, who was another opposition figure, when they promised they would never run against each other. Yeah. And what did they do? They ran against each other. And that's when the general won. But then Kim Young-sam won, and then Kim Dae-jung won. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
What about planning for unintended consequences after those incidents?
Yeah. You're always going to have unintended consequences. I mean, when I was young, I was briefly in the Navy, and they put me in the Marines for a while. And I'll never forget, they always said that your first engagement with the enemy blew up any plan that you had. And they drummed into my head, and I still have it in my head, even though it happened when I was 18 years old, was in any situation, you assess, you adapt, means it can change, and then you act. Assess, adapt, act. So you always have to have your ear to the ground and look for those unintended consequences. And unintended consequences go good and bad, happen all the time. And the only thing is to assess and adapt and act on them when they occur. But sometimes it creates failure too. So no, it's a problem. Anything that's unanticipated is unanticipated. So, and there's a lot of that especially if you're acting a lot. I think as I went on, we tried to think more carefully and know the context much more clearly than we did at first when we were younger. I don't know if that answers. Yes?
In your examples, it seems you have dealing with a lot of bad government. And I think in my personal field, I personally feel that every government is have some kind of dirty things underground, big or small, but they all have something dirty. So how do you think if it is dirty enough to have have something, a foundation doing something to change them, or bringing someone to take place? Because a lot of foundation was based in USA. So if any government is doing something dirty and you send someone from here,
Including the U.S.
yeah. So it kind of, how do you define it? You are helping them instead of output U.S. value, or?
That's part of the problem. I mean, what you always try to do is deal with people who are within the country. So they were essentially determining what the priorities were and anything, and not you. You were enabling them. I mean, I used to say the most effective grants are, you don't say, I want to give you a grant, this is what I want you to do. You say, we have this problem, I can give you some money, will you try to figure it out in enabling? You know, nowadays it's more like, I'll give you the money, you do what I tell you to do. But that's what we did to try to get around that issue. Also, in most governments, there are also good people and sort of good people, and you try to find those people. There's always somebody buried somewhere that actually makes it work. You know, I mean, one of the things that was amazing to me within the human rights field, and I didn't talk about all the like financial fields and other fields I worked in, but in the human rights field, I was always amazed worldwide. People would stand up, and they would say, I would ask them, I'd say, you know, this is dangerous. Why are you standing up? And they would stand up from all walks of life. You know, fairly wealthy, poor. You know, religious, not religious. It was sort of random scattering of people. And when you ask them why they were standing up, you know, and I expected some big philosophical discussion or whatever, they always say, well, it's wrong. This is wrong. You know, it wasn't a big discussion. And in most of the cases, I think that we acted, it was very clear. Somebody was slaughtering people, you know. It was that kind of thing. They were involved in vicious, violent ethnic cleansing or death squads, you know, with no due process or anything, just going in and shooting people. So in those days, it was pretty clear in most cases. And there were people within those countries who you were allying with and enabling, you know, so it wasn't you determining it. Because, you know, that was always a danger to bring in, you know, U.S. values and things. If there are still values, I hope, but to bring in, you know, an outside value, and culturally. Sometimes those worked well, though, cultural values that were different. For example, in some cases in South America, if we had to get documents out, we'd always give them to the most beautiful blonde we had, woman in our group, and inevitably she wouldn't be searched, and they'd just walk her right through the line. So, you know, we did take advantage of it sometimes. Probably incorrectly, but it worked.
I'm going to take one more question. And then we'll
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
Since now you're retired. Retired. Yeah.
Retired.
And when you look back, how would you describe the relationship between your foundation and the U.S. government? Is it like labor? Employee and boss, or lover?
Well, lovers is very ambiguous. That can be quite a violent relationship too, right? That's you know, this is corny, but I mean, this country gave me tremendous social mobility. I mean, I came out of the stockyards in Chicago, and gave me tremendous opportunity to go to elite institutions and stuff I never would have had. That said, especially in all governments, but our government did a lot of, and does a lot of bad things and needs to be held accountable. And spotlight has to be put on them. So I would say I'm a supportive critic, but I've sued, you know, I didn't go through it, but we've been involved in suits. We've sued the CIA, for example, for psychic driving experiments. You know, that's a whole nother story. MK Ultra program, on behalf of somebody who was turned from a neurotic into a psychotic. We tried suing him again about somebody who was given LSD, unbeknownst to them, and jumping out a window. But then the Congress passed a law that you couldn't sue him. I mean, there are lots of lawsuits that we've been involved in against the government. I personally sued the FBI once. There's a case called Lindblom versus the FBI. I ultimately lost, but it was the funny part about that lawsuit is it stayed in the district court's desk for 3 years before he made a decision. He made a decision, I won't go through all the procedural things, but he did a procedural abnormality and decided against me. Went up to the Court of Appeals in DC. They announced, I think on Christmas Eve or somewhere early around that time, that I had lost. And then around New Year's Eve, they announced the guy who I sued in the FBI, a guy named Earl Pitts, was arrested as a Russian spy. So, but I lost the case. It was 2-1 with a vigorous dissent. My son came up to me. My son went to law school at Harvard and came up and he said, "Dad, your case is in the law book, case book for national security." I said, "Thanks, son." I think, but anyway, thanks.